I'm pleased to be joined today by Dr. Dean Hamer. He's a geneticist, author of several books, including The God Gene and the Science of Desire, and a filmmaker. Dean's recent work focuses on gender and sexuality in the Pacific Islands. Dean, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
From what I can tell, Dean, you're a real polymath spanning from genetics to writing books to filmmaking. It's really amazing, and I'm curious what got you started in all this, how you piece it all together.
I've always had a wide range of interest, and I think polymath is a very polite expression for somebody that's just wanders about and does whatever they're curious about.
Right.
Uh, but that's indeed been my career. But I really started in the sexuality field as an academic and as a researcher, starting in the early 1990s. I had just turned 40, sort of a bellwether time in a person's life. I'd had the health, studying in minute detail a very fascinating process that had absolutely no impact on human life, which was the regulation of metallothionein gene expression by heavy metal ions in the yeast, no less. And I had just gotten to that sort of point where I was interested in working on something that had a little bit more impact and that might be more directly related to people's lives. And so I started searching around for possible topics. This occurred at a time when there was a real technical revolution going on in molecular science and in genetics. And of course, that was the sequencing of the genome and the discovery of PCR. And suddenly the availability of mapping thousands or tens of thousands of genes in a person that had never been possible before. And so I sort of put together those two things and said, wow, it would be really interesting to apply this new mapping technology to something important about humans. And after looking at a lot of traits, it just hit me one day about what about sexual orientation? Because it's so important. And I'm gay, so I'm not worried about intruding any place. And as soon as I spent 5 minutes on the internet, which was just barely available then, I realized it's something that had never really been studied. So like most scientists, if you find something that's really important and fundamental, and there's a new way to study it and nobody else is doing it, it's like, oh my gosh, this is really
Mhm.
interesting. So that's sort of how I got attracted to that field.
I'd heard that long before the genetics research, there was this puzzle among evolutionary biologists and psychologists of how we do have this stable population of people who are gay, and that's also rare across species. I've heard in some species, like sheep, some exhibit exclusive homosexual preferences, but you would think, like from a naive evolutionary perspective, that if you're not leaving offspring behind, then how could those genes persist? And then there's all sorts of theories as to what could be maybe the compensatory mechanisms, like maybe it's some sort of recessive trait that benefits the majority. And then if you get a couple copies, then maybe some subset might not reproduce, but on aggregate as a species, it it turns out to be adaptive. Does that explanation still hold?
Um, there's actually a much better explanation. But as I began becoming interested in the topic, it was quickly clear there was very little research on the formal genetics. So these are twin studies, family studies. There have been a few. They all pointed toward a genetic basis. But of course, they can't tell you what the genes are or what they're doing. And then the other active area of research was what you just mentioned, which was to try and solve the evolutionary puzzle. How can a gene that makes you gay survive in a population? Because gay people don't have babies. Of course, gay people do have babies and always have. I have a daughter, for example, and she has two lesbian moms, and their genes are flowing. Well, two of our genes are flowing through her. But it was indeed a puzzle. And there are all sorts of cool explanations. You know, the gay uncle who decorates the cave and makes it more attractive so the niece gets more suitors, or other sorts of helping things. And what that made me think was we will never understand any of this unless we actually have some idea what the genes are and what they're doing and what the pathway is. Because otherwise, you're just juggling ideas really without any materiality that's associated with them. And you really can't understand what's happening at all. So that just made me more resolved that if we were going to make any progress in this field, we had to start understanding the underlying mechanisms, the underlying what's happening in the brain, what different chemicals are involved, what exactly is going on. And of course, that's where, at least at that point, we thought quite logically that genetics would be a really powerful tool. This is how, if you can discover a gene for something, you can know what proteins and what mechanisms are involved. So that was a very large scientific impetus for the work.
Did you work with Michael Bailey at all? Do you know him?
I know Michael very well. I didn't work with him, though with some of his colleagues, but he was in the sort of same time as I was, and he was coming through from the classic psychological route. Psychologists don't, do beakers or test tubes and stuff, but they do good family genetics work and family studies. And Michael was doing that. He was doing it with, he started out actually with some of the old guard guys like Michael Pillard, a guy who's the age that I am now at that time, who had been doing family studies. And those were all reinforcing the idea that there was a substantial genetic component. Everybody knew genes were involved, and everybody knew genes weren't the only thing, that environment was at least equally important. And that was about as far as it had gone. I think people also were at that time still investigating the rather old-fashioned idea that, well, your sexuality is controlled by your sex. Males like one thing, females like another. So it must be something to do with sexual differentiation. Therefore, it must be something to do with hormones. And a lot of people were trying to look into what were testosterone levels or what were estrogen levels in gay men and lesbians. And that type of research was going on too.
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that got me interested in this field of sexuality research. I did a podcast with Mike Bailey a while back, and now he's on my dissertation committee. And most of my research has been on hormones and brain development. I did a couple projects on brain development in kids with congenital adrenal hyperplasia. That got me thinking about prenatal androgens a lot. And since then, I've looked into other genetic and hormonal explanations for gender dysphoria, which is what I'm doing my dissertation on and working with Mike on.
Oh, that's great. That's a really important field. And there's no doubt in my mind that there has to be some sort of pathway that leads to both sexual orientation and to gender. And it's extremely likely that those pathways are intertwined at the core. Another way of thinking about it very simplistically, but also importantly, is that the first step is whether you have TDY or not. And if you do, you go down one pathway of maleness and androgen control. And if you don't, you go down the other pathway. And everything in sexuality and everything in gender identity and gender dysphoria is subsequent someplace down that pathway. And that's why they're interlinked so closely. And hormones play a huge role in that pathway because that's the way that you signal that, hey, what sex you are, and therefore a whole lot of different biology, whether you grow a penis or a vagina, and whether you have breasts or not, all depends on that pathway. And sexuality and gender are clearly a part of that pathway, with a whole bunch of other stuff affecting them as well, both social and biological. But those are certainly key.
Now, I'm playing a lot of catch up because much of this research from the 90s and beforehand was all before I was born in 99. But my sense from everything I've read is that from the very start of it, it had this real polarizing effect within the gay community and just in general of some people thinking this is great evidence for born this way. This is what we've been saying all along. It's great that everything has a scientific explanation. There's nothing wrong with you. And then others who are deeply offended by the work and feeling like it's medicalizing or pathologizing it. And that hasn't really gone away. I see the exact same controversy within research on causes of gender dysphoria.
Yes, you are absolutely correct. The balance has shifted over time, and that's for a variety of political and social reasons. And certainly there's a lot to be said on both sides of the debate. But we're now in a position where we've been collecting data since before you were born on what's actually happened with the knowledge that has been gained. So when you start thinking about these experiments, they started after World War II, really, but they really accelerated in the 1990s. And you have Simon LeVay with his first study on the brain, showing a particular region of the hypothalamus being different between gay men and not. And then you had the initial molecular genetic studies, which gained a lot more attention than the family studies, just because they were more au courant and also closer to the bone, I would say. At that time, there were the arguments that you suggested. There was those who were disturbed because they thought that type of information might be used to prenatally diagnose people's sexual orientation and that gay babies would be aborted. People thought it might be used to develop drugs or other means of corrective treatments that would somehow make people straight. People thought that it would be used in a philosophical sense to say that, oh, being gay is a sickness, it's a disease, it's a mutation, it's ill, something like that. And so we can look at what's happened since 1990 in that field. None of that has been true. Just all completely red herrings and unnecessary fears. There hasn't been any prenatal diagnosis or really any attempt or even mention of prenatal diagnosis by anybody that I'm aware of. And I follow this in China and Russia as well as in the United States, not to mention in Africa. The philosophical argument that this is going to cause people that think it's a disease is exactly wrong, precisely incorrect. The people that are anti-gay hate the idea that it's genetic. They've developed entire journals around, pseudo journals with pseudoscientists proving that it's not genetic. They have pages and pages of web content and tons of social media saying it's not genetic. So it's the exact opposite what you would expect. And then, of course, there hasn't been any, sort of rational based treatment or whatever either. So none of the fears, which could have been logical, not unreasonable fears, especially given the homophobia in the 1990s, but it just hasn't been true. But then you can ask on the other side, so what has been the results of the research? This is hard to parse because, there's a lot of different factors that affect society and people's beliefs about things. But the research that has been done points pretty consistently to the fact that knowledge about sexual orientation and gender origins correlates with a positive attitude towards queer rights, essentially. And there have been large surveys that, they've been doing these surveys since the 1970s. It's part of the standard Gallup poll that they do every 2 or 3 years to ask people, do you think that being gay essentially is born in or that it's taught? And then they also ask people questions about, do you think it's moral to be gay? More recently, do you think gay marriage is okay, et cetera? And the correlation is extremely strong. People that think that being gay is natural are also in general for gay civil rights and same-sex marriage and everything else. And people that think that it is not natural and that it's learned are against those. In fact, 75% of people who think that being gay is taught or learned also think that being gay should be illegal. So I'd be in jail instead of talking to you on Zoom. So this is a tremendous correlation. And then there's been various attempts to, do studies where you go into a college classroom and you teach some of them this and some of them that have generally pointed in the same direction, although not nearly as strongly. So my conclusion from the data over 30 years is that knowing more about what makes people gay or what makes people trans or what makes people fluid is a good thing. And not knowing is definitely not a good thing. If you look back in history a little, people forget just how difficult it's been for gay people over historical time. So I'm sorry if I'm cheering up. I watched last night a movie, and it was about testicular transplants. And you're probably thinking, what are people thinking about? There were people who were taking gay men and taking their balls out and replanting them either with a straight person's testicles or testicles from a sheep. It did not work out well, it turns out. But, it wasn't funny at the time. There were a lot of people that got lobotomies in the United States, a lot, including people that just, were accused of being gay in the army, in the military. There were people who went through electroshock therapy, again, very common. And there continue to be people that are subjected to conversion therapy because now, as long as it's done by a minister, it's legal. None of that was based on scientific research. All of that was because people didn't understand the origins of sexuality and thought it was unnatural and thought it was a disease because they had the wrong information. So there's a certain point where even if your intent is good and you think you are improving ethics, you really have to look at the consequences of what you're doing carefully to make sure that you're not promoting exactly the wrong side. And for me, usually the biggest clue is if the bad guys, and there are clearly bad guys in this debate, if the bad guys are supporting what you're doing, that's not good. You better think a little bit more closely. So when right-wingers start citing your research, it's like, this is a real problem. So that's my view on the ethics of things.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I've seen the same polarization in the transgender debate today, and it seems even trickier because it seems like we're talking about separate populations. There's the types with early onset gender dysphoria, which might be following the same innate genetic or hormonal pathway, and then there's this rapid rise in later onset cases, particularly in teenage girls, that might be following some different mechanism. And it seems tricky to even ask those critical questions because of this unethical history of conversion therapy and pathologizing sexual orientation. And you ask the same thing with gender identity, and it's all tied up in the same type of civil rights progress. It's been a really tricky conversation to have, although really fulfilling at the same time to be able to have it in a nuanced way, like through this podcast, and when I'm able to talk to people about these research areas, people who are willing to listen.
Gender is even more tricky, in part because your gender is all the time. Sexual orientation, looking at me, you can't tell that I'm gay. Well, maybe the shirt, who knows? But gender, is about presentation. And so that just makes it much more on the surface. And second of all, because people, I think, find it even more difficult to understand. It's so obvious to us why I feel like I'm male that it's really difficult to understand why anybody would feel different than that. So yeah, I think it is. It's extremely tricky. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. No, I don't know much about genetics, Dean, but from what I've looked into with some of your early research, the genetic variants or the genes implicated seem to have something to do with androgen function or androgen receptor function, and that seems to connect with what I know about these different DSDs, where perhaps due to hormonal changes during early critical stages of brain development, that could be where you're seeing some of the effects. And you mentioned earlier that there is now a better understanding, an evolutionary perspective, than a lot of the theories that were tossed around earlier. Am I on the right track?
You are. So let me briefly review what's happened in genetics. So in 1993, we published the first molecular genetic paper on sexual orientation. we found at least a subset of men showed a pattern in their families that was consistent with female transmission, which naturally would lead to the expectation that the gene might be on the X chromosome, because moms pass on their X chromosomes to their sons and never to their daughters. And so we followed that up with a molecular study, and we found a statistically significant linkage on the X chromosome at one region called XQ28. Like all linkage studies, it says there's something there, but it tells you nothing at all about what it is, what it does, or how it works. It's just not what linkage does. It just says there's a region on the chromosome. That's all. Modest finding, big impact, a lot of interest, a lot of controversy, etc. Things stayed at that same position all the way up until 2019. There were 3 other papers that replicated the XQ28 finding at various levels of significance. There was one paper that did not find it at all, done by a Canadian group that was their only paper ever on sexual orientation. There was a lot of other, there was a genome-wide linkage that we did. There was statistical analysis and so on. But it basically stayed at that same level. At that time, in 1993, based on the stats, we thought the gene region we discovered might have an effect on maybe 2 or 3% of the total variance. So that might seem small, but actually it's significant, and it's easily traceable, 2 or 3%. That's what we thought, and we thought maybe there are 10 to 100 other genes that might be involved, something like that. That seemed like a pretty complicated thing. And that's sort of what everybody was thinking. What then happened in the ensuing, whatever that is, 30 years, is that as people began to study more and more different complex traits with the new genetics, every time the techniques got better, the number of genes increased. And so by 2019, it became an essential part of the dogma that every complex trait was controlled by thousands or tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of different genes. And that's true whether it's a personality trait or schizophrenia or alcohol consumption or even height or weight, for example. Tens or hundreds of thousands of genes are involved. In 2019, finally a study was done on sexual orientation with the new techniques and with a large sample. And that's exactly what was found. Like for every other complex trait, 100,000 genes, something like that. And not only that, but the variance was spread kind of equally over them. They saw 5 that they thought might be significant, never replicated. But there's 99,000 that we have no idea what they are and that are of smaller significance. So what we now think is that, and the total heritability that was calculated from that study was somewhere around 25%, lower than the 50% from twin studies. But it's a very well-known artifact of these association studies that they miss heritability. So for example, the first GWAS study of height, a heritability of height of 5%. But we know height is 80% heritable. The other 20% is diet. So when they said 25% from genes, that's like, oh, that's easily 50%. So it's somewhere in that range. So what we know now is the same thing we knew in 1993. It's heritable to a significant degree, but there's not a gay gene and there's not the gay genes. There are thousands and thousands of gay genes. Interesting point. So first of all, why is it that all complex traits are this way? Like you never get, if you get mutations in the main pathway, they're only a tiny bit of the story. Apparently our evolution has worked out that if you want to preserve genes for traits that are, or the preservation of genes that aren't good for reproduction necessarily, has to have the mutations they'll spread out all over the place. I don't know why, nobody knows why, but that's just generally the case. The other take-home lesson is that genetics is now not useful for understanding mechanism. You can't do anything with 100,000 genes. And even if you look at the 5, like one of them is for smell. Oh, maybe smell is involved. Yeah, sure. But if it's 0.0001% of the variance, really, You'd have to be very lucky for it to be the one that's actually in the central pathway. So this is a bummer for scientists. Um, but, that's the way it goes. Nature wasn't designed for us to figure out how it works.
One of the most confusing parts about that for me is that when I think of hundreds of thousands of genes, and it's not a normal distribution per se, it's more like it's skewed so that most people are heterosexual, I would still think that the more of those genes you manipulate, the more you slowly start to deviate from heterosexuality. So it's more like a spectrum. And we do see some of that, but you see this big peak where it's actually, at least in men, more common if you're non-heterosexual to be gay than to be bi. Is that right?
Yes, but just because you have even a bell-shaped curve like that, there are lots of forces that then can cause that to bifurcate and to become two different peaks. And just think of anything that's autocatalytic or that leads in a certain way. It can easily take the phenotypic distribution cannot mimic the genetic distribution through a variety of different ways. So I understand it would seem like maybe should be more like a spectrum. Gender maybe behaves more that way to some degree. But it's not an irresolvable paradox.
What do you make of the sex difference where for females it does seem like having sexuality more in the middle is more common?
Well, if you were one of those evolutionary psychologists who believe in the theory of sex differences all relating to reproduction, whereby men have jillions of sperm and therefore we just want to find somebody and fuck it because we have to give the highest possibility. And females want to protect their eggs, so they have to find just their exact right person. It kind of fits into that scenario. I think that's probably a vast oversimplification, but the phenomenon is certainly true. I had worked in molecular biology all my life. I'd never done anything in sex, so I became a sexologist when I was 40 years old, or I tried to anyway. And that involved doing a lot of interviews of people. And most of the gay men I interviewed, the stories were pretty familiar. Yeah, I realized when I was 4 that I liked guys, but I had to hide it, etc. Women were very different. And I particularly remember a woman like about my mother's age. She was in her 70s, I guess. She'd been married twice. She'd always been heterosexual. She liked sex with men. She'd never had any experience with women at all. She never even thought about it at all. So just straight out, Kinsey, zero, heterosexual. And at the end of the interview, she said, well, Dr. Hamer, there's one thing you didn't ask me. And I was like, what's that? She said, you didn't ask me about my next partner. It's like, she's like, I may be 70, but I'm still interested. And I assume my next partner will be a woman because the men in my age are just, completely hopeless and I'm not interested in them. And I was like, cool, that's great. You never hear like a 70-year-old guy saying that suddenly I'm going to go gay because there's no decent woman around. So women are, it's just true. Women are a lot more fluid than men are. Yeah.
Right. That's interesting. What do you make of Ray Blanchard's birth order and maternal immunity theory?
I think the evidence is really piled up very well indeed. And there have been a lot of studies of the birth order effect, and they really do hold up, and they hold up cross-culturally. It's a significant effect. That is a couple of percent of the variance, maybe 10%, something like that. In terms of the mechanism, I think that's a complete unknown. And actually, Ray Blanchard's ideas are right. I think he was a student, Tony, one of the students in Canada has taken that further and actually done some molecular studies and tried to identify a protein that seems to be correlated with that. Whether that's true or not remains to be seen. But I certainly think there's something there. What it is, we don't know yet, but there's definitely something there. And that easily could be some sort of hormonal blockage or selection, something like that.
To recap the theory for our audience, I know demographically this is true. So gay men with older brothers or men with older brothers are more likely to be gay, not dramatically more, but a little bit. And then the theory for the mechanism, this is where I would ask you to fill in the details for me, Dean, but I heard something about because a mother's immune system is more female calibrated, that once a male starts growing in her who has higher androgen levels, perhaps there's going to be some maternal antibodies that are responding to those. And it's almost like an inoculation. And then the my understanding of the theory kind of breaks down, but I guess it's that if you have a second or third male growing after the mother's dampened down the immune response to allow those androgens to flow, or actually the opposite, I guess, that once she's inoculated, the immune response would be stronger. So perhaps the baby's androgen levels are suppressed, and then you get more feminizing traits. That's the theory.
That's exactly the theory. You said it better than I could have. And the only flip to that is that now a protein has been identified that correlates with that idea, and that appears in mothers that have had sons. So it's kind of like the women are being vaccinated against boys or boyishness, essentially. That's the
So that's yet another interesting piece of evidence that seems to be piling up in the prenatal hormones direction. Now I want to turn to animal studies. Again, it's
wait. Why don't we go back to the question of evolution? Because we didn't. I had promised you to tell you a little bit about what has been discovered through the new genetics and the new mapping, of large populations of people with many, many genetic markers. So the same group that did the 2019 study, led by Brendan Zeich, who's a very good population geneticist in Australia, I believe, then did a reanalysis of the data to ask the question, well, we've identified this group of 50 or 100,000 genes that are associated with being gay and men. What else are they associated with in the relatives of those people? And what was fascinating is they found that those same genes in heterosexual men were associated with having a higher number of female sexual partners. So the genes that are making me gay would make my straight brother even more attractive to women. This is great. That is enough to balance out the effect of the genes. And since there's a lot more straight people than there are gay people, it doesn't have to make them that much more attractive for it to work. It's called antagonistic pleiotropy, well-established mechanism for maintenance of a variety of genes that seem to be harmful, but actually can be helpful at the same time. And so it works out well. It's quite clear that this is the case in men. It appears the same in women, although not quite as strongly. We had originally hypothesized that what made gay men gay would make their sisters have more sexual partners. For a gene on the X chromosome, this is the best way for things to work, because if the gene makes me, first of all, the gene, you can imagine the mechanism. Imagine a gene that makes you think guys are hot. I get that gene, I'm gay. Okay, I'm not gonna have so many babies. My sister gets that gene. She thinks men are really hot, really hot, and she has more sexual partners. But in the population study, that doesn't come up so much. It's actually in the same sex. So this is a very reasonable mechanistic effect for genes. It also satisfies the old belief that, of course, gay men are just, prettier and more attractive than sexual men are, sort of like, and nicer people also, and just better in every possible way. I mean, every woman knows that. And so, it makes a lot of sense. And it would be easily enough to explain the persistence of this large complex pleiotropic genes that is associated with sexual orientation.
Mm-hmm. I've seen some statistics showing that between same-sex couples, male-male versus male-female, the gay males have way more sex. And there's a couple theories for that. One could just be that in general, males are going to have the higher sex drive. So you pair two males together and there's just no breaks, so to speak. So that could be the case even if gay men don't have higher sex drive. But then also in this antagonistic pleiotropy way, you could imagine that is there, on top of that,
right,
sex difference, also genes for higher sex drive in general?
Yeah. That's also possible, and that could well be part of it. Yeah. It's not so much, I don't think, that we have higher sex drive. It's that we have much more willing partners because they're the same thing. I mean, I don't know if there's Grinder. Well, there sort of is Grinder for straight couples, but I bet it's not as popular as the real one.
Right. So we've also been talking a lot about gay as if it's one thing, and
Hmm.
I um I hope this is the appropriate terminology, but you hear about tops and bottoms, and I'm wondering if there's a different actual genetic basis for that, because I've also seen that, strangely, even though we're piling up all this evidence for the prenatal hormones theory, those evidence are stronger in females. Like if you think of females with congenital adrenal hyperplasia, much more likely to be gay, females with higher androgens in general. So then you might flip that and say males with lower androgens are more likely to be gay. And I I mean, it seems like that's a less obvious relationship, or uh and I'm wondering, could it be confounded by, well, maybe if lower androgens make you more feminine, uh, then that could put you in a more submissive role. And see, now I'm hesitant to go here because you see that it's getting borderline borderline controversial. But I think you see where my logic is going. Do you want to fill in the science there?
No, because I'm not sure that that really is scientific, especially for tops versus bottoms, for which there's a
Hmm.
lot of cultural things going on as well. And there's no doubt at all about the correlation between early childhood gender behaviors and sexual orientation. Everybody knows that. It's the stuff of stereotypes because it's also true in large part. But in terms of androgen levels and et cetera, I think what is pretty clear is that that is associated with initiation of sexual practices and also probably what we would call sex drive. So people with lower males with lower testosterone levels tend to start sex later, and they're not as insistent. This is in all the interviews I did, I was always surprised by people that said, "Oh, I didn't really even know I was gay until I was 19, or I wasn't interested in guys until I was 21." And then those individuals also frequently are not that interested in sex, even when they are gay, and even when they're in a relationship, and so on. So I think that that correlation with sex drive is pretty true. Which brings up just an interesting point. When people had this sort of science wrong and thought that gay was because of having low testosterone, some brilliant scientists after the testicular transplant era started injecting gay men with testosterone. And this, of course, gave you extremely horny gay men who wanted to go out and have more sex. So I think, yeah, looking at like adult hormone levels and sexual behavior at any level gets tricky. Even more so, and here social constructionists are right in a sense that your hormone levels are also very profoundly affected by your experience. So that after sex, testosterone rises pretty dramatically, and women that are in aggressive positions often have much higher testosterone levels than do other females. So I think trying to make correlations with adult circulating hormone levels is probably fraught.
Hmm. And these differences between, say, more dominant and submissive types wouldn't be scientifically grounded, or at least not anything that doesn't exist within heterosexual couples as well, due to other personality differences.
That's a good way of putting it. It's not something that is exclusive to gay or lesbian folks. It's a variability that's also seen across everybody, I think.
Hmm. So returning to the animal research idea, so at least if you take adults and you manipulate their testosterone levels, you'll manipulate their sex drive, but not their sexual orientation. I've heard of these animal studies where if it's during an early enough prenatal critical window, where either in males you block androgens, then when they hit puberty, this is in rodents, instead of mounting other females, they'll exhibit this female lordosis behavior, like arching their back up, essentially preparing to be mounted. And you can see females with high induced androgens do the opposite, that they'll attempt to mount. So that seems pretty dramatic, as if you can actually change their sexual orientation. But I also don't want to sensationalize it because I'm not familiar with the primary research, because that sounds actually too extreme. And I think we would probably have a greater sense of how causal the hormones are if those findings held up as robustly as I just framed it.
Those were experiments that were important and cited widely in the 1980s, early 1990s, I would say. I don't know that there's been any evidence against those experiments subsequently, but they haven't been followed up so much. And I think the reason why is that you simply can't do that type of experiments in humans. And so it hasn't been a pathway that could be easily followed on. I do think that if you bathe the brain in hormones of the opposite sex, it's going to have an effect probably on multiple different aspects and multiple different behaviors. So yeah, it makes sense. I mean, another way of thinking of that is what happens if you swap out the brain between males and females? Did they become more male or more female? I guess
Mhm.
so. Yeah. For
So,
me, animal studies, what's most interesting is the work that's been done in Drosophila melanogaster, the common fruit fly. Has nothing to do directly with humans, but it does tell you the sorts of pathways that might be involved in other species, because we're all dictated by the same DNA, and all biochemical pathways are related one way or another. And in Drosophila, sex determination is complex. It involves a whole series of different genes. There's a very well-defined pathway. It has multiple branch points, and you can actually say chromosome number determines whether you're male or female. Then there's a breakpoint that determines certain areas of the brain, another breakpoint that determines certain anatomical features, another breakpoint for other anatomical features, another breakpoint for particular behaviors involved in copulation. And Drosophila has, just like humans, has a very stereotypical pathway towards sex. They show all types of mating behaviors, flapping their wings in the females, lining up their butts with the mouth, etc. And each of those is subject to a genetic control that is part of a pathway. So it's likely that there's some pathway similar in all organisms. There's no reason to think that that would not be the case. In humans and many other species, it's going to be affected by a lot of other things, including socialization, mores, all types of different stuff. But there is an underlying, fairly simple pathway that's underneath there somewhere. So that's interesting to know.
yeah. There's an interesting connection between all of this and philosophy of mind as well, because when we think of sexual attraction, like for humans, you're going to have literally a mental representation of the opposite sex or the same sex and the features that you're attracted to. And the
Right.
strange thing is, it's not obvious what we're thinking of. Like your mind doesn't immediately go to genitals when you're thinking of sexual attraction. There's all sorts of culturally learned factors. Well, it could, but not necessarily exclusively. And then, but I know some species, and the simpler you go down the evolutionary ladder, it's probably not the case that they're necessarily perceiving and mentally representing attraction. They could be just following some sort of pheromonal cue in a very mechanistic way, right? And I imprinting seems kind of related to this to me, because you could imagine just you don't really have an innate ability to recognize conspecifics. You just evolve this simple computational heuristic, like if there's movement shortly after you hatch, imprint onto that thing, because if you hatch near something that isn't your mother anyway, you're probably dead anyways. So there's not necessarily any added reward for being able to visually recognize your mother. And I imagine that a lot of species could evolve sexual orientation based on some sort of heuristic cue like that. And I've heard of in some bird species, there's an analogous sexual imprinting where if it's a sexually dimorphic species where the male is brightly colored, then you could have females have this innate hardwiring to perceive certain patterns or certain colors as attractive. So they'll always get the species right. But then certain males, it's kind of like imprinting, where you can introduce in a lab setting the wrong female bird, where if you have a closely related species and they're all sort of similar looking, that they'll essentially imprint on the first one. And then you could reintroduce the proper species, even if they've sexually imprinted on the wrong species, and they won't then mate with their proper female species. So it's making me wonder of what's actually going on in the brain, either in the human brain or across species, when we think of sexual attraction. Because one possibility, the philosophy of mind sense, is you just form this abstract web of features related to gender, some of which are physiology, some of which are culturally learned things. And then on the opposite extreme, you're not even thinking about it. You're just responding innately to some sort of heuristic cue.
I think you raise a really good question about how desire gets formulated in the brain. And I think both of those theories are fine theories. There almost has to be some sort of imprinting mechanism, because it's hard to imagine that there's a homunculus of, like a tall blonde basketball player in my head somewhere that led to my sexual fantasies.
Right.
But on the other hand, it's hard to believe that it's completely controlled by that. There has to be some sort of genetic hardwiring that in a male makes you much more interested in males than in females. And it can't be purely imprinting, because guys that are brought up, I don't know, in an all-male environment somehow, and guys that are brought up in an all-female environment don't systematically vary in their sexual interest as adults. So
Mhm.
there has some sort of analyzation as well. How those work is pretty much a total mystery. And there had been various attempts to suss that out. There was one theory that was called how the exotic becomes erotic, was a popular theory for a while, and basically said you get interested in the one that you can't have or that's exotic. But there's an equal number of, and that's true in many instances. And in an equal number of instances, exactly the opposite is true. So there's no question that people form something in their mind that is their sexually responsive to thing. Not even clear that it's totally in the mind, I have to say. But there's something that goes on, but how that is formed, I don't know. It's
Mhm.
vague.
A lot of my research has been on puberty and brain development, all in humans, primary research wise, but I've read a good amount of animal research. And you see these interesting effects of pheromones on pubertal timing. So, particularly in females, you introduce a sexually mature, non-related male, and it can accelerate puberty in females and inhibit puberty in males, or not even inhibit puberty per se, but like in these types of primates, like where there's an alpha silverback gorilla, the males get into this sort of pseudo mature state where they've gone through puberty and grown to a certain degree, but they'll never get the silver fur unless they actually rise to that alpha rank. And there seems to be some type of maybe pheromones inhibiting certain things, or some other biological mechanism behind it. And then similarly in humans, you see that girls with stepfathers go through puberty significantly earlier. Small difference, as in statistically significant. It's unclear whether that's the same type of, there's some unconscious smell-based mechanism, like for how a lot of animals recognize kin by smell. So if you look at, for example, this critical window for adopted siblings not being attracted to each other and having that sort of innate disgust response, versus you get a step sibling after puberty, and even if your family, at least that's a lot of bad porn plot that you see nowadays. But there seems to be, at least in animal research, this critical window that seems to be smell based, that you can actually manipulate to have that sort of conspecific recognition, and maybe disgust mediated as well to inhibit sex drive. you familiar with these things?
I was not familiar with that research, but it all makes sense to me. But as terms of how that applies to sexual orientation, one can only say that most likely whatever the differences are that are affecting sexual orientation are upstream of that particular mechanism. In other words, well, it's an interesting question if those mechanisms work the same in male and females. I suppose you could have changes in the whatever that you would call that. It's not really imprinting, is it? It's hormones. It's a pheromone sensing or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
You could have changes in those that also affected sexual orientation.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that sexual orientation so often goes along with differences in gender presentation tells me that probably most of the variation is further upstream than that.
Mm-hmm.
Still, the mechanism is interesting. It's always curious to know why the brain does what the brain does.
Yeah, it opens up a few extra questions for me because, well, for one thing, it wouldn't surprise me if it was hormone levels during some critical pubertal window when you're actually having sexual development, where sexual orientation is determined. But as you mentioned, there's all sorts of early childhood signals of it. So it's interesting that that happens. And I'm wondering if it's partially related to this kin recognition thing that has a pre-pubertal critical window. And that makes sense evolutionarily. Why, if there's going to be some critical window for recognizing who's your immediate family, who would be dangerous to reproduce with versus who's okay, well, if that's maybe the earlier reason that you would have evolved this earlier plasticity for sexual orientation, then maybe sexual orientation in the gender sense also just is swooped up along with that. So then by the time of puberty, it's like you already have the innate wiring set up, and then you just actually manifest the desire.
It's possible. Makes sense. I don't even know how to test that exactly, but it's certainly possible.
Mm-hmm. There's also debate about whether sexual orientation is uniquely something that's gendered, and it only makes sense to talk about it in that way versus something like preferences or kinks, if they're innate and if there's genetic evidence for it. And like you mentioned, there's at least going to be small genetic influence on pretty much everything, every psychological trait. So do you believe it makes sense to talk about sexual orientation for anything but gender?
Oh, so you're talking about when people are attracted to people without limbs, for example, or to dead people or children. Is that what you're talking
Yeah,
about?
I guess I wasn't thinking that extreme fetish, but if we're talking about it, might as well talk about the extremes. Does it make sense to frame anything as an orientation except an innate attraction to gender, or could you have an innate orientation towards a whole number of features?
So that's one of those questions about whether it's better to study the whole or study a bit, and that can't really be answered. But the way I would look at that is the vast majority of variation in what we call sexual orientation is in regard to whether you like same sex versus opposite sex, because most people are attracted at that sort of level of broadness. And even though there might be more specificity, I like blondes versus I like redheads, or I like tall people versus short people, or passive versus dominant. The choice of male or female is on top of all that. It's very rare, not never, but it's unusual to find a person that's just attracted to redheads and would take it one whether they're male or female.
Mm-hmm.
But all the time you find people that are just attracted to males or just attracted to females and wouldn't take the other. So just thinking about it in terms of what's important in the world, it's sexual orientation in regard to the person's gender. That's the most important. I think the other point is that when you look at sexual orientation in regard to gender, it's not strongly correlated with other types of orientations or sexual desires or paraphilias. In fact, and that's been subject for a lot of research because of the long persistent myth that gay men are all pedophiles and they're grooming children, etc. So people have looked at that carefully, and it's just not true at all. So I think it's probably, from a research point and from a philosophical point, most important to look at sexual orientation in regard to people's gender, whether they're interested in same sex, opposite sex, or both. I think the other areas are interesting. And if you're trying to figure out like imprinting stuff, looking at paraphilia like necrophilia, fascinating. There's something that, it's really rare. And it's something very specific. And there must have been a cue someplace that made people interested in that. Great from a research point of view. Probably not readily funded at the current time, I would say. But from a pure research view, great. The other thing I just want to say about that, because somebody's going to listen to this podcast and go, oh my God, Dean Himmer wants now to study necrophilia, is that whether or not there is a underlying scientific basis to any of the things that we've discussed is totally and completely separate from their moral importance and whether they are good or bad. So the fact that sexual orientation has a 50% genetic component, it's important scientifically, has nothing to do whether or not there should be laws discriminating against gay people or not laws discriminating against gay people. They're really two separate issues. And the same for necrophilia or other fetishes that are clearly harmful to other people. And they're immoral because they infringe on the rights of other people. And for that reason alone.
It's interesting that on one hand, the science does not or should not have any bearing on morals. But as you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, intuitively, people do seem more accepting once they learn that it's innate.
This is absolutely true. And that's a good thing because it would be bad if it were the opposite way around. But it is that way. And this is true even, it's so interesting. For example, especially when we were doing this work in the 90s, when there was still a lot of controversy about sexual orientation. And where if you had anything about gay on the news, you always had to have some minister or somebody coming in and saying being gay was bad. It was a very different situation. And when being gay was still illegal in, most states in the United States. I mean, we didn't have freedom from sodomy laws until 2003. But even at that time, what was really interesting was interacting with people like Mormon families who have a very strong cultural and religious belief about, gay being bad and your whole family gets punished and you've got to take your kid to therapy, etc. But Mormon parents were the ones who most relied upon and were most ecstatic about the genetic evidence. They just really thought it was good. And I was kind of like, but Mom, that means it came from you. But they didn't see it that way at all. They saw that as something coming from outside, basically, something that was or God's will or whatever. And so, yeah, there's been a big embrace of the born that way idea. That's our anthem, born that way, for good reason.
Mm-hmm. But what about this mind-body dualism in sexual orientation? Because we're talking about it's an orientation towards gender, but I know recently there's been controversy because of the whole transgender debate where you could say, well, you could imagine a gay person who will or will not consider dating someone who's trans and identifying as the same gender, as in gay with respect only to sex, and then genitalia really matters versus gay with respect to gender, identity, personality, all these other clusters.
I think that is more in the realm of personal interest and choice than it is a major mind-body philosophical debate. I'm sure there are plenty of gay men who would never go close to a female to male trans man because the genitalia are different. And there are plenty others who can be quite attractive. I think those trans boys are kind of cute sometimes, They're like the ultimate twink, basically. But I don't think, to me, that's not a philosophical debate. That's just part of the intricate mesh of different factors that determine the level of sexual appeal of one person to another. Yeah.
Hmm. I typically avoid talking politics on this podcast, but at least insofar as it's been impacting research on sex and gender, I'm curious about your opinions on recent changes. I know you worked at the NIH for a long time, and you probably have some knowledge of their inner workings. And what do you make of this recent situation?
It's the saddest thing I've ever seen in American history. We have a research enterprise in the United States that's grown up since the Second World War and before. That's been a marvel. You know, people have found a treatment for AIDS. People were dying of AIDS for a long time. And we now have somebody in the White House who thinks that HIV doesn't cause AIDS. It's like having some medieval religious person running the most important aspect, the thing that affects everybody in the United States, in the world, in charge. It's just beyond bizarre. I can understand people not liking trans folks or using them as a target or not liking the type of research that we did. But we're now in a position where we're not going to have vaccines. We're not going to have cures. We're not going to have research. The entire NIH has been shut down. It's just bizarre. It goes so beyond anything that I can even imagine that I'm speechless and intensely mournful. Let me say about research on sexual orientation. So the biggest cause of our lack of information about sexual orientation has been the lack of scientific research. And that in turn is due to two causes. First of all, it's considered controversial and therefore people want to stay away from it. It's also been hurt by the fact that those of us who are doing the work seriously are not looking for a cure. We're not looking for a drug. We're not trying to make anything better. Everything is fine. We're just trying to do basic understanding. And that is less popular than things that affect people's lives in a positive way, like vaccines or treatments, for example. And then this right-wing shift that began really in the last decade or so, where it's become almost acceptable to call gay people predators, for example, has hurt things even further. I have to also say that some of the people that have been involved in the ethical survey of this research have had a negative impact. They've made it too difficult for straight people to do the research. And we can't really just have gay people doing the research. There aren't enough of us, and no one's going to believe us because they think we're all prejudiced. We need our straight allies to do research just as much as they do for friends and family of gays and lesbians and stuff. And the ethical debates have made that virtually impossible. And the so-called ethics have also just really put a hamper on publication, I think. It was quite amazing that the most recent paper about the genetics of the evolution of the genes that are involved. There was one scientific paper, it was a great paper, in the same journal published 4 articles by so-called ethicists talking about whether it was good or it was bad or, and so on. A really bizarre sort of reversal. It would be like, if I published a paper on a new treatment to prevent HIV infection in women, if there are then 4 papers saying, well, that might be good or might not be good, et cetera. So it's a difficult time. In the current atmosphere, it seems like this research is now going to be not only slowed down, but just virtually stopped. I'm very sad. I had the idea a few years ago of establishing something with the Kinsey Institute to try and promote research on the biology of sexuality, and in the form of either a prize, an annual prize, or an annual fellowship, and hopefully something that would actually pay for a year a year postdoc fellowship or a year in a good university. And I was really excited about that idea, but as time is going along, there's less and less evidence that that could be useful because there's fewer and fewer people that are in the field. So not a good situation.
Yeah, I've been cautioned against it, against studying gender dysphoria, for example, because I was in a lab that was doing, basic incremental progress, like mapping out hormonal effects on human brain development in this big human connectome project sample. That research is still going on. Part of the reason I got so interested in it is because, well, to build the causal theories, I was reading a lot of animal research where you can do this experimental manipulation. So
Hmm.
effectively, like puberty blockers or manipulating sex hormone levels within animals. And that got me thinking a lot about the neurodevelopmental side effects of these types of treatments in humans, which no one was really talking about. And I reached out to some psychiatrists working at these gender clinics, pioneering gender affirming care in minors, and asked them about it. Uh, it seemed like there was a lot of this concern, sort of ethical, at least framed as if it's ethical reasons not for studying it, because any little side effect or big side effect could be just magnified in the media and weaponized in this political way that has been happening. On the other hand, well, for informed consent reasons, you want to know all about the side effects of any potential treatment. So that seems like I mean, it's still this ongoing ethical issue. And I had ideas to do uh, neuroimaging studies on these kids. The clinics unfortunately weren't able to share data, which made sense, especially given the politics and given that I'm coming at it from kind of an outside area as just as a trainee. So that's what got me interested in just studying the psychological phenomenon of gender dysphoria itself, and looking at the developmental changes in adolescence in recent years.
Hmm. Interesting. Uh, just if you can do anything in animals about how gender is formed or identity or whatever we call it, I think that is a terrifically good idea. And there shouldn't be any reason that that would be suspect because um, it's in animals and it's a very basic question. And it's something fundamental about biology. And without gender, we don't have sexual reproduction, uh, et cetera. And yes, it's much better to do it in animals because you can do experimental manipulations and you can actually prove a hypothesis, or at least come close to proving a hypothesis. And um, one can also do mutant searches in animals. So if you're working in rodents, there's a huge library now of knockout mutants in individual genes. So if you hit a gene in one of the pathways, even though that might not be the source of variation in populations, it can still tell you a tremendous amount about the pathway. So that's terrific. And I hope that lab, you continues to get funded. In terms of the human work, it's going to be inherently controversial, no matter what you do. What I can tell you is when I was first starting my research on sexual orientation, first person I had to tell was my lab chief, this French Swiss woman, who smoked a lot of cigarettes, really amazing biochemist. She discovered some really important stuff. And she was one of very few women who at that, had come through and got her PhD and was a lab chief at the NIH. Big deal, big position. And I told her about my plans. And she was like, what about this and what about that? And then she said, very interesting. Just be careful. Keep away from the psychiatrist. Keep away from the psychiatrist. And that is the advice that I would offer to you. It's really amazing what bad scientists they are. I was kind of shocked. I had never done anything in the behavior field, but when I started doing sexual orientation, obviously I was reading a lot of papers about measuring sexual orientation and personality inventories and stuff like that. And the history of psychiatrists in that field was just so horrible, so terrible. I mean, the way they said all women had hysteria for a long time, and then they started giving everybody speed, basically. And then the tools that they've developed for measuring psychology and stuff are just so rampantly wrong. Anyway, keep away from psychiatrists and listen to neurobiologists and the like. In terms of politics of reckoning all that, it's going to be tricky, but I hope you do something because it's a really important field, and you'll be a star.
Thank you, Dean. You might have heard of the whole media storm surrounding the so-called transgender mice. First of all, most of them were transgenic, but aside from that, there were important studies that I've been following looking at the effects of puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones on mice brain development. It was just really ironic to me because the conservatives that were talking about the potential harms of these hormonal treatments, which I had some concern and sympathy for, those would be the best studies to show it. So you would think they would be championing funding that.
Right. I had just read the headlines that it was transgenic mice, not transgender, and I did not delve into the details at all because there's so many stupid things going on. It's hard to know what to focus on exactly. But yeah, those are great studies. And yes, there should be concern about giving puberty blockers to anybody because you want to make sure that you're not harming something else that was not what you intended to do. Of course.
But though you've been keeping up with it, you've been out of the research game for a while, and I'm curious about how that happened and how you got into the filmmaking and other things you've been focusing on in recent years.
It really started with the research I was doing on sexual orientation because I wasn't totally satisfied with the media coverage that we got. It seemed like people were oversimplifying all the time. And I started thinking about, well, how can I present the argument? And I felt, yeah, I'm a scientist, but I'm also responsible for the effects of what I do. I have to take personal responsibility for that. So I need to explain things better. And that got me interested in writing. And so I ended up writing a first book about this, on the science of desire. And then that went well. So I wrote 2 other books about genes and behavior. And I found that a good way to communicate with the public. But it also made me wonder, how can I do this even more effectively? 40,000 people read a book. It's not that many people. And they're all people at a university or at a bookstore in Seattle or someplace. It's a limited audience. That got me interested in filmmaking, and I started working a little bit on storytelling with cameras. And then what happened is I met Joe Wilson, who's now my husband. We got married up in Canada. He announced our marriage in the paper of the small rural town he grew up in Pennsylvania. It caused a big stir. And all of a sudden, we got really interested in telling people about what gay life was in rural America. And nobody else was willing to do it for us. So we did just like what you're doing now with this podcast. We said, well, I guess we'll get a camera and we'll go out and make a story ourselves. And that's how we got kind of started in filmmaking. And then that turned into be something really interesting because we were able to reach a lot more people. And we got a grant from Sundance, and then we made a film, and then it went on PBS. We were like, oh, this is interesting. And then during a trip to Hawaii, we met a fascinating woman here who was a cultural icon and a native Hawaiian, and who's also transgender, or mahu, which is the word in Hawaiian. And her story was fascinating, and that just got us started on a whole new path. And by that time, I was getting 60-ish, and I was ready to retire. And I kind of feel like I've always enjoyed doing science, but I actually like working in the laboratory. That's what I love about science, is doing experiments. And then at 60, your ability to do that starts declining. But my interest in filmmaking built up. So once again, I just completely switched fields and became a filmmaker. All of which has led me to living here in Hawaii, being in the Pacific, and learning firsthand that everything we've learned about how gay people are wrong, and that's always been the case, and transgender people are wrong, that's always been the case, is actually not the history of the world. That there's a whole different parallel history and cultures that are very different from that and have been for a very long time. And that's been really fascinating and made me a lot more aware of the power of culture over people's lives. So yeah, that's what's keeping us busy.
I had this mentor during my undergrad at USC. He was a chaplain there, and my final year, the year that I graduated, he was also the year that he retired. But he said he's not retiring, he's entiring, as in entering this whole new phase of life and doing other creative writing projects and all that thing. So it sounds like you're in entirement.
I am tired, and now I'm working much harder than I did even at the NIH. And I used to work really hard at the NIH, but now because of the miracles of communication and all this, you can work 24 hours a day basically, and it seems like there's always something to do. But yeah, it's quite fascinating. In Polynesia, gender variability has always been here, and it's always been recognized, and people that are in between male and female have long been recognized as having special qualities. They're the people who memorize the chants. They're the people who take care of the kids. They're the people who pass on the culture. And they were really revered. That went away with colonization and with the missionaries, but it's being reclaimed now. And I think that's been a really positive development and sort of a model for the trans movement across the world.
That's been an interesting thread as I've learned more about the sexology research. I've been coming more from the psychology and biological side as we've been talking about, but learning that there's this whole cultural anthropology set of research that's documenting gender norms cross-culturally and how much they differ from what we're exposed to in the West.
It's very significant. I had always thought that there's a sort of inherent dislike of homosexuality and of transgenderism because it's not normal or whatever. But it really does have a very cultural basis, and it's only completely normal and mainstream in all of the societies that have in Christianity and Muslim and Jewish societies, and that's it. The rest of the world is quite different. So even in China, although it's very different today, there's a long tradition of same-sex relationships being acknowledged and being very important. Same in Japan. Of course, everyone talks about ancient Greece and how integrated same-sex relationships were in society. And it's certainly true in Polynesia. So there is a lot more historic variability than people are aware of, I think.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting what you said about in Asia, because my understanding was, well, I've heard a lot of people talk about Greeks and Romans. I've seen more so in polytheistic religions like in India and Polynesia and some indigenous cultures that you see more of that acceptance. But then what had been standouts to me, and maybe this is just a product of the modern era, is that within China and Africa in particular, that you see even less acceptance that you do in Europe.
So Africa, I know very little about, although I know there are sort of trans and shaman type traditions. China, though, is quite interesting. Today, China seems very conformist. It's not religiously based. It's based on for 5,000 years of Chinese tradition, and Confucius said, basically. But in fact, historically, same-sex relationships have been a huge part of Chinese history, starting with the Yellow Emperor in the Han Dynasty in 2000 BC. He had a boyfriend emperor, a co-emperor, basically. And that was true all the way up until the 1800s. That same-sex relationship played an important role in court. They were much talked about in books. But, colonization occurred in China even without being colonized. Intellectual colonization happened big time. And once the revolution in 1910 and Sun Yat-sen, there was a really basic transformation. So that tradition in China is a recent tradition. It's not an old one. In Japan, it's even more clear. So the Buddhist monasteries in Japan were total gay hotspots, like all men monasteries are, basically. In samurai culture, same-sex relations were the thing, like in Athens or like in Greece. And again, it was only with the Meiji Reformation in 1850 that they started adapting more Western things. So it's not, the anti-gay part is not nearly as normalized or as widespread as it's interesting.
That might have also been where I got this dominant submission idea that we were talking about before, even if it's a mischaracterization. When you hear about it historically, it's often talked about in those terms of power dynamics.
Yeah, that's something I'm studying now a little bit, actually. We have a friend who runs the Oscar Wilde tours. I take gay men around the world, like to Greece and stuff, and look at gay stuff in history, who's written a lot on that subject. There were also sort of classic gay relationships of the sport that we think about. And there was also switching, look at the story of Alexander the Great. Have you ever read The Persian Boy? No, the dancer, the dancing boy. It's one of Mary Renault. Have you ever heard of Mary Renault?
No.
So she's an author who wrote classic sort of love novels about ancient Greece and stuff with a same-sex twist to them. And there's a beautiful one about Alexander the Great, who was the younger lover of the king of Greece, of Macedonia at that time, and whom he grieved greatly and had a very close sexual relationship with. It was well known. They were together forever. And then his lover is killed in war. He grieves him for 5 years. And then he takes up with a young Persian boy who's a dancer boy. So yes, there were younger relationships, but it's not like one was a dominant and one was a subordinate all the time. I mean, Alexander went from bottom to top, or whatever you want to call it, over time. So there was more. It wasn't just that. People also often talk about that in terms of iconic relationships in Hawaii, which are the same thing. It would often be an ali'i with a younger warrior who was his lover. But they also switched, and they also had different lovers and of different ages and stuff. And a lot, you hear about the top ones because that's what's passed down in literature, but there's a lot more variability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was reflecting in prep for this interview how ignorant I am about Polynesian culture and really just most areas outside of, I guess, what in academia you talk about as this historical Western canon. Like thinking about mythology, I was a big fan of Greek mythology growing up. Little bit learning about others, like little bit in Native American, but Pacific Islands is hardly talked about in American culture. Maybe that's beginning to change, but it's funny because they're closer to us geographically.
Yeah, we are always overlooked. There's no question about that. And
But you're changing that.
we're trying to change that. And we got a lot of interest in the story of Kapai Mahu, which are these 4 healers that came from Tahiti and brought the healing arts. And they were all gender fluid. They were a Mahu. They were not male or female. They were a combination of both. And that's part of what made them such good healers. So it wasn't just coincidental. It was part of what gave them their status and their mana and their skills and everything. And after they left, the people erected these 4 stones that carried their living spirits that are still here. But not surprisingly, that story got totally suppressed. And the Mahu part in particular is what was left behind. So we've been working on restoring that story. We found the original handwritten manuscript in the back of the library, made that into an animated film. And that was popular. It was shortlisted for an Oscar. And then sort of what I've learned from trying to teach people about science is that if you want to reach an audience, you got to do a lot of different things. You can't just do one thing. So we took the animated film and we made a PBS documentary out of it. This is great. PBS goes into 80% of the households in the United States. And then we worked with the local museum, the Bishop Museum, and did a big exhibition, an 8,000 square foot exhibition about it. They got a lot of local press and a lot of national interest as well. And then we took all the stuff from the exhibition and put it in the convention center, not all of it, but some of it. So now when dentists are coming in or psychologists are coming in for their convention, they hear about this story. And right now, the reason I'm going to have to leave in not too distant future, we're putting on a hula show every night on Waikiki Beach in the middle of the tourist zone. about this story, and it's being danced out through hula and being told through song. And all these tourists are just wandering around looking for a free show, and they get to see a show about this. So, yeah, it's an exciting thing. And still, it's probably, 0.00001% of the people in the world know this story. But that's up. That's up a lot from what it used to be.
Yeah. Moana must have made a big splash. How do you think they did? Was that representative?
This is a question that's caused a lot of controversy. I think they tried really hard. I think they did really well by having a whole group of different people. And especially now that Moana has been translated into Hawaiian, I think it's really a wonderful learning tool. It's not an exact recitation of history, but it wasn't meant to be. It's a cartoon. It's a Disney cartoon. I think they did a really lovely job.
Uh-huh.
And the voice of Moana, it turns out, is bisexual. So that's cool.
Oh, interesting. What a great way to spend your retirement, and it sounds like you're close to the ocean and get to be in nice, beautiful, warm weather.
It's a beautiful place. Our last film, called Icone, which is about same-sex relationships, was formulated while we were underwater, while I was underwater with my husband, swimming and enjoying the Pacific. And a lot of the film took place underwater. So yeah, it's a wonderful place to not retire.
Thank you, Dean. Is there anything else you want to share about the science or about your films or resources our listeners should look into?
Our latest work is called the Le Pua'ala Queer Histories of Hawaii Project. And if you go to queerhistoriesofhawaii.org, you can find out all about it and tell us your experiences. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your time, Dean.
All right. Thank you, Adam. Adam,